Keep 100% of your claim. G4 Claims.
If you've been hurt in a road accident that wasn't your fault, you should really talk to G4 Claims first. Unlike road accident solicitors, we don't charge you for our services, which could see you better off. To keep 100% of your compensation, have a chat with Nicole and the team. You'll be glad you did. Search online for G4 Claims.
Keep 100% of your claim. G4 Claims.
Hi and welcome to this week's episode of the DW podcast. I am joined by Matthew Collins. Thanks for coming on, Matthew. How you doing?
Good. It is like looking in a mirror here, isn't it? I should have brushed my hair. I'm very well. I was just telling you, I had COVID last week, so I've got a bit of. I've had a little bit of cabin fever. I guess it's,
First night out in a wee while last night.
First night, like Monday night when you run down the pub and there's no one there. But that's actually quite good. I enjoyed my own company. I've done the pub quiz and everything.
Because there's no competition.
None at all. No, I was the smartest man in the pub.
When I was getting you on, Matt, I was thinking, how do I describe you at present? Do I describe you as an author, a researcher for Hope Not Hate? What would you say about yourself?
Well, I do a lot of shoe modelling and gloves, but author, Gordon Bennett, yeah, that would upset some people. Yeah, author. I run the intelligence. That's not an oxymoron. I run the intelligence at Hope Not Hate, which is basically using all legal methods to destabilise the far right in this country. Some things we can't talk about. You just have to accept they're happening. That's sexy, isn't it?
It sounds exciting. Sounds very exciting. And for those that don't know, it's been almost full circle for yourself. I was very late to the party reading your book. My Life in the Far Right. I only read it.
Right. Yeah, you probably got to it so late. I didn't get paid for you buying a copy. Yes, it's full circle, I guess. It's so long ago. I've been doing anti-fascism longer than I was doing fascism by about probably 10 times longer. But yeah, as a very young man, a boy, I guess as a teenager, I got involved with the National Front as it was then, and the British National Party and Combat 18 in the sort of mid to late 1980s, and then through to 1993 when I left the country. I worked on I did 3 years sort of. I did 3 years as a fascist, a horrible little Nazi, and then I did 3 further years passing information, working for the magazine as it was known then, as Searchlight, passing information to them. And towards the end of that period, I took part. I worked with World in Action, which did the first big expose of Combat 18, and then I went to live in Australia almost straight after that, and I did 10 years there.
I think the question for many people would be, and I think there's lots of factors to this, Matthew. Like, when you're a young man, what attracts you to a group like the National Front or the BNP or any sort of far-right fringe group?
I think everybody has different stories. And also those organisations are much different now than they were then. But look, I've been over this like thousands of times, and it's not a particularly easy thing just to put one, just put one finger on it. I was attracted to, I guess it had a sense of inclusion, small and nasty. I was very much attracted to its racism. I'm not one of those people that sort of always seems to say, oh, I was duped and I had these legitimate concerns and then I became a Nazi. I had concerns, and I think some of which are legitimate. If people are worried or concerned about where they grow up or change it or change or their own part in society. But I was racist. I was horrendous. I was a horrendous little racist, and I became a teenage racist, and then I became a teenage Nazi. And this was, this was in the 1980s. There was no internet. You couldn't find the National Front in the phone book.
Yeah.
But I hunted and hunted and hunted until eventually I found them and I joined. And for me, a curious teenager, but not particularly bright, the National Front, was brilliant. It opened my eyes to a lot of things. It gave me answers and solutions to a lot of things, those probing questions, and it took, like I say, I think quite genuine fears and concerns that young people have, or all people have, about growing up and leaving school. It articulated to me exactly how I was feeling about myself and society, and that was it. I was hooked. I became a member.
Do you think, I mean, I'm obviously from Motherwell in North Lanarkshire, and, it's a very post-industrial town, and I suppose at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, you could apply that rhetoric to many, many towns and places across the whole of the UK. They're coming out of an industrial boom and into a mega decline, and I wonder for a lot of males, that there wasn't that pathway to work as easy as there was maybe for their
Yeah,
family.
well, I grew up in South London. We weren't, we weren't mourning the loss of the coal industry or the
Absolutely.
steel industry. I mean, everyone I went to school with either joined the army or went to work with their dad on a building, or went to work with their dad or a cousin or a brother on a building site. But most of the friends I knew, even my own brothers. But you're right. That sort of picture in time right across the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, even in Northern Ireland, people, I think a really quite brutal period in British history, economically, and industrially, a country, Britain, has seemed to be in continual decline since before even I was born. And then how people dealt with that, because it was a time of, I mean, we've got quite a challenging prime minister at the moment, but I think those are really challenging times. I grew up, my formative years were spent, the television was dominated by industrial unrest, the dangers of the trade union, the loony left, war in the Falklands, restoring our pride, murder and bomb and terrorism, racism, and for a young boy in South London, that was the picture I had growing up. But funny looking back on it now, I guess because I look back at a terribly wasted or misspent youth. They were exciting, and I think probably intelligent times as well, in the way that people stood up to and resisted what was happening, even though ultimately I guess many people may feel that they lost or they didn't get their just rewards for it. I think looking how people now challenge or resist things, haven't really got a spot on how things were done then. But
I think something that you touched on, in your book, My Life in the Far Right, was you were very different to a lot of people at your high school as well. And I suppose it's almost giving yourself a sense of identity, even if they think, what's Matt doing? Who's these people he's hanging around with? I don't get it. To you, it made total sense at the time.
it made total sense to me, to be a cross between the class clown, class idiot, and potentially dangerous individual. And by the time I was 16, I guess I wasn't really a class clown or class idiot anymore. I was in an organisation that for most people didn't even exist anymore. National Front only existed on walls as graffiti. It had become like a byword for nasty racists, and I was actually inside. I was actually inside that organisation. I remember the friends that I had at the time were sort of disturbed that I'd actually joined this group, this political party that I'd always spoken about and dreamed about that no one ever saw or heard of anymore. And then I think I just turned up to school one day and said, "Oh, I've joined the National Front. I found them." And everybody just went, "I think you might have gone a little bit too far this time." But there you go. I found them and I joined them. And then I think probably later on I did quite a good job of contributing to their complete destruction. But time will tell, I guess.
Do you know what? At the time, Matt, when you did join them, you touched on it earlier as well. You said, it's not like there was the internet. You couldn't Google it and find out where these people were hanging about or where their meetings were. Like, what was the process like with that? And were they welcoming at first? Because it's, as you've been very involved in yourself, there is a lot of paranoia and, who these people are they spying on? Is this person genuine?
Yeah, they would. Oh, see that Shagger's elbow. My elbow fell off the table. No, they were incredibly paranoid. But I was also very, very young. I was 15, so I was no real chance I was one of these mythical MI5 or MI6 agents.
Totally.
I also remember at the same time the BNP actually leafleted where I lived to say that I went from nothing to being overwhelmed with it. But no, they were terribly welcoming. I was very, very young, which they like, obviously, because that's new blood. So it brings life to the movement, brings young life to the movement. And they were incredibly paranoid, but also they were very, very welcoming. People obviously don't like to hear that, but you wouldn't hang around with them if they weren't welcome. You wouldn't hang around with them if they weren't friendly. And it's getting to that period in my life where, at 15, I was incredibly bored with school and life and home and all of these things. And the National Front was just, in a very, very small world. I mean, they didn't open the world to me, obviously, because much of happened in a phone box. It was that small. Yeah. But I learned an incredible lot about myself, about how racists and fascists think. I'd never really read books or magazines, and it's funny because although I thought at the time I was very, very political, I'd never really been in a political party, and then suddenly I was in the National Front, and they were engaged in sort of political activities like leafleting or trying to sell newspapers, standing in elections. So they opened up that whole world to me. But also about it being very, very welcoming. It was also very, very depressing.
Yeah.
And you got in the 1980s, you really need to understand that across the country there was probably no less than 1,000 across the United Kingdom people who were paid up subscribed members to both. There was two National Fronts at the time, to the National Front and the BNP or the British Movement. No way was there more than 1,000 across the country, and everywhere we went, we ended up getting turned over because there were just greater numbers of anti-fascists. It was probably a great time to be an anti-fascist because as long as you stayed alert, they could keep the likes of us back then, under control.
I think it's important to remember, in the 1980s, Britain was totally different from what it was now. You tell the stories if you've gone down Brick Lane in a sun.
Yeah.
Immigration were nowhere near what they were like now. People's tolerance probably wasn't what it was like now as well. It was a totally different time, wasn't it?
I think it was a very, very different time. Obviously, Justin, I mean, you speak about Brick Lane. I grew up in Southeast London. We never did anything like going to East London. Yeah. I did write a little bit about it in Hate, I guess. But there was this massive battle between the far right and groups like Anti-Fascist Action, Red Action, the Away Team, for control of that pitch right on the corner of Brick Lane and Bethnal Green Road, because obviously it was historically, it was close to Cable Street, and it was an emotional spot because of that. But also, it had been a meeting place around there for fascists and the far right for decades and decades, and it was quite a day out to go over to East London, stand on the corner of that street and sell your newspapers, and you'd meet old Mosleyites, you'd meet people that had been involved in the National Front in the 70s, that was the area, despite the fact it had a really large and vibrant Bengali community who'd opened lots of restaurants on Brick Lane. It was also for decades sort of the centre of where fascists and Nazis would meet in the capital every Sunday. And I mean, from there, obviously, the BNP launched and met there and launched their campaign later on into the Isle of Dogs, where they won their first seat in 1993. But also throughout 92 and 93, it was just a massive battleground. Every Sunday just turned into like a massive brawl. And a bit old for that now, but you would take your life in your own hands going down there if you were going down there to engage in fascist activity. But of course that made it part of the fun as well. I guess for fascists who were out to beat up Nazis, Sunday was a big day out. In everybody's calendar, it was a massive day out.
Going into work on a Monday morning with a bit of a sore head many a time, I can imagine.
Well, I worked for some of that period. I was actually working for the National Front. So if you didn't go to work on a Monday with a black eye, they'd think you hadn't put your effort in on the weekend.
I think as well, you touched on the BNP there, and I think for anyone involved in politics or interested in, left-wing or right-wing politics, the way that the BNP mobilised and went from a kind of street gang, right-wing thuggish group to being an electoral force. I know they never essentially got much further than European Parliament or seats, but the way that they mobilised and actually got people elected was worrying to a certain degree, but also, you have to say, impressive.
Yeah. So, it is impressive or depressing, because I spoke about it before. Yeah. If anti-fascists kept them in check, or if anti-fascists kept an eye on it, problematically, there was rumbles of change in the BNP around about 92, 93. They felt that environmentally that there was opportunities, but they weren't necessarily getting the returns at the ballot box, even though they got Derek Beacon elected and they had some mildly impressive results around that time. They were more picking up members than they were picking up votes. Numerically, they became physically stronger. And then that had to change because it was also impossible, even though they became numerically strong and they engaged, of course, in far different sorts of violence, because from that, of course, came Combat 18. But in terms of as a party to function, they had to move away from the confrontations themselves, because they couldn't win those confrontations, and they were also bad for business. But I think this was articulated by, I think, groups like Red Action and Anti-Fascist Action did articulate. They could see it, with the coming of New Labour, that there would be more and more people who would disengage from mainstream politics. There would be more and more people who would felt ignored or felt let down. And similarly, the people in the BNP, I don't know necessarily whether they would have sat down and studied exactly what it was that the left was saying about the changes in Labour and the coming of New Labour, but they themselves understood, even if they couldn't properly articulate, that there were opportunities for them to cash in. And the other thing that I think people fail to understand and realise is that these people who were involved then were, the fascists themselves were genuinely invested in this, in these ideas about taking over communities bit by bit, about creating an environment where people of colour couldn't function, where people of colour would find it very, very difficult to live or to function or to work or to trade in those areas. And it wasn't just simply a case of fascist boot boys turn up and go around terrorising people. It was done systemically.
Yeah.
And it was done properly. And the thing, for a while they were able to create environments because they managed to recruit so many people to take part in this. They were capable of putting 60 or 70 people out to do leafleting and to do acts of intimidation for a while. But by the same respect, there was quite a large pushback against them as well. But the long-term future did look, I think, did look rather rosy for the far right, and it upped its game to the point where you couldn't just do physical responses to the rise of fascism. You actually had to take on and tackle some of the issues on which they felt they were winning, or which some people on the left felt they were losing, or issues which were then and still are now, I guess, very, very difficult to tackle.
Yeah, I think, that's just my opinion, and you can disagree, Matt, or you can maybe agree, but
I never disagree.
I feel that, that the BNP and more recently, UKIP's influence on the likes of the Conservative Party, the far right have almost pushed what you would class as, the electable right further to the right. And you touched on it yourself in your book that you were invited along to the House of Commons by Conservative MPs.
House of Lords.
House of Lords, yeah. When you were involved with basically Nazi politics, I
went to the Soodley rooms to hear Clive Derby-Lewis, who was later implicated in the murder of Chris Hani of the ANC. I went to see him speak at the House of Lords with the BNP. I don't necessarily think the BNP had a large effect on Tory party policy in general. I think the growth of the BNP up to, say, 2009 had an effect on the mainstream of politics in our country. And then when the BNP was collapsing, and then UKIP, there was in 2009 there were 1 million votes for the BNP. That's a substantial number of votes. So UKIP picked up the majority. I would assume the majority of those 1 million votes, and UKIP went from a party of the right to, I think, move to a hard right position, because it took 1 million BNP votes with it. And then the rise of UKIP, of course, that ate into the Tory party, and then the Tory party adopted some of UKIP's policies.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of people sort of assume now that somehow the BNP or UKIP are in power in this country. They're not. The Tories are in power. And the language that we now hear, which is dominated by race, almost completely dominated by race and law and order, laws that don't seem to apply to this government. That's the mainstream narrative now. The things that we are hearing that perhaps people don't like or people get upset about, they assume somehow it's coming from a hidden corner in a room. It's not. It's the mainstream narrative. And if you buy some of the big newspapers and you read what they're saying about our country, you would get a very very, very disturbing picture about sort of race relations in our country. And that is potentially why I think at the moment the extreme far right cannot get a foothold electorally, and most of the extreme far right are either not politically active or aren't active in a political sense, that they just cannot break through, that there's nothing they can add into that narrative, because obviously there's a limit to what people can or will accept and listen to. I think the main problem for people engaged in anti-racism and anti-fascism is actually we have a mainstream problem.
Yeah.
Depressing, isn't it?
It's ridiculous, absolutely. One thing that I wanted to touch on, obviously being from the west of Scotland, we often get caught up in this political bubble that exists in here and also in the north of Ireland. And back in your day, the National Front and the BNP were also, I think that we think of the far right as very insular and they think about their own area. But you were creating international relations as well with, right-wing people in America, but also across the water in the north of Ireland as well. And that was something that you came very close to as well. Yeah,
well, in fact, that's almost come reverse now. The Irish question, how the British far right tackle it and deal with it, is almost in complete reverse of what it was then. There's a very good journalist. I won't mention him. He's a Northern Irish journalist who works in Glasgow, and he and I always talk about this. Hi, Jerry Braden. If you're, and he always says to me, I won't do a Belfast accent, but he always says to me, Matt, just how many paddies were in the National Front in the 80s? And I reel off the names: Tim O'Shea, Black Murphy, the Nash brothers. Yeah, almost all of the National Front active in London in the 80s were of Irish descent.
And yourself
But
included as well. Yeah.
myself included. Yeah. My father, he won't be watching or listening to this, I hope. But yeah, almost all of us were of Irish descent. But none of us were inclined to Irish nationalism or republicanism. Mainly because, of course, television, as I said before, was dominated by murder and bombs, and there was no more comfortable position to take for cowards than to sit in London and take sides in it, or send money off, or some of my colleagues eventually did themselves, try and ship arms and weapons there. But I think there's always been this idea that somehow the National Front or the BNP were funding loyalist paramilitaries, and certainly money did flow, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it was more pennies than pounds. I think up until then, when Combat 18 came around, because they were quite engaged in serious criminality, I guess I know there was an increase in weaponry and drugs that were used to raise funds for it. But the underpinning thing, I think, particularly in the support for loyalism and unionism, was anti-Irish racism as well. And again, that seems like a strange thing to say, but the National Front and the BNP was almost completely dominated by what you would call Anglo-Irish people, who all took a quite an extreme, violent and racist dislike to Ireland and the Irish question. And so that became obviously the expressions of support for the UDA, UFF, and the UVF. But I'm not a psychologist. I can't explain why that is. But that's the. A guy was telling me the other day that most white jihadis have ginger hair, and I've actually just seen that disproved that it's not the case. But I don't understand why. But the British far right has been dominated by the Anglo-Irish, but why it's always traditionally took that loyalist position, but now some of the new groups coming up started with National Action and now a Patriotic Alternative, because the situation in the 6 counties is very, very different. They don't have to take that sort of reactionary position about it. And we've seen now quite a bit, particularly amongst new far-right members, who don't understand, although of course it is complicated, but don't understand why there is a Northern Ireland and not a united Ireland. And we've seen, because that's our job, communications between the British far right and the Irish far right. And the British far right are almost completely with hands in the air. We don't understand this. We don't know. We think you should all be one homogenous indigenous island.
Yeah. It's interesting. I actually remember seeing recently, or maybe about a year or so ago, the videos of National Action in Dublin getting chased off the streets. And it's not from the outside looking in, it's not really an area where I thought a group like this would breed and would grow,
Well, they did have a couple of supporters in the Republic of Ireland, but again, National Action didn't particularly take that Little Englander idea. It was an organisation that was, whereas let's say the National Front and the BNP were dominated by fascism and neo-Nazism. National Action in particular was just dominated by race. I'm not sure they ever did turn up in Dublin. I think that might have been one of the offshoots of one of Tommy Robinson's groups who were dealt with, and Irish fascists who were dealt with on the Irish train system. But no, the thing, that whole thing has changed dramatically. And you look at the support for loyalists and unionists now, it comes from really, really old British fascists who themselves actually sometimes find their own opinions on Northern Ireland out of step with mainstream unionism. And now, of course, there are so many more things that they could be debating or learning or trying to understand about there, but it's beyond them all. So one side are dominated. One part of the British far right are still dominated by anti-Irish racism and the sort of the new breed of Nazis and fascists don't understand what happened in the six counties and are so disinterested to it to the point that they just see it's a lot of white people fighting each other.
Yeah.
We should never talk about Ireland podcasts unless it's about football or Cork. I really don't like talking about it.
Absolutely. Matt, we touched on your life in the far right.
Yeah.
You said at the start of the show you've been involved now more in anti-fascist politics and anti-fascist action for longer than you have in the far right. Was there a light bulb moment for those that are listening or watching that haven't heard your story before, or what made you turn yourself in and start shopping in your comrades, so to speak?
I mean, we always talk about the pivotal moment. I guess the great moment of doubt was the attack at Welling Library, which, of course, just came to underpin some of the doubts I was beginning to have. I mean, one of the criticisms about Hate was that I didn't really explore politics or anything like that, but there weren't really any politics. And people find it hard to believe. They just generally, we didn't discuss politics, and although we engaged in politics, we didn't have discussions about it. We went through motions about it. The general activities were violent or was violence. So there was a number of times. Obviously, you get nagged at by family members. It was just, we were talking about that sort of period, that there were the sort of people who went out to protest to keep hospitals open, or protested to keep schools open, or people who went on strike to protect their jobs. And then there were people who went out to beat people up because of their colour. And I just sort of thought that I thought maybe the fascists are getting it wrong. I mean, the health of a nation is in hospitals and libraries and jobs and work. And I mean, it's easy to look back now, and it's almost 30 years ago. It's more than 30 years ago. But I just, so put in the sort of lack of class analysis, the deliberate ignorance of it, that not talking about the poverty that almost all of us came from, or all of us suffered, was I felt it undermined us. It undermined our arguments. That the anti-trade unionism was, I think, again, alienated us, and I began to feel that that really, being isolated from the rest of society wasn't particularly healthy for me, or wasn't particularly healthy for them. And then there was that moment in Welling Library where, of course, they attacked all and everything and everyone in there. I just realised then, a small light bulb in my head, that really all that is ever going to happen is we will go around just beating people up, and that that is a large part of racism and racial hatred and fascism, obviously. But I didn't feel it was going to change anything. How can it? It's like going out to play for football 90 minutes every week, and the other team gets a full professional kit and squad, and you have to start 10-0 down. I mean, really, that's what it was like. And I just began, very, very slowly, just began to think about some of those issues. And I do think probably the National Front did help me in some regard, because I realised on almost every position they took on something, it was the opposing opinion that was probably right. I just wanted, at the end of the day, I think now, looking back, I just wanted a better life. Sure. I just wanted to live somewhere nice. I wanted to live somewhere better. I wanted my mum to have proper employment with security. I wanted all of those things, which, of course, the National Front would tell you that everybody else has but us. And, of course, you're not going to get it by beating everybody up. So that's the cheeky 49-year-old trying to explain what was going on in the mind of 19 or 20-year-old. But basically, that was my doubts were, we're all going to go to prison and we won't have achieved anything.
Yeah.
And even, now, we're awash with former BNP members who joined the BNP, for instance, on its way up, who obviously 62 councillors and 2 MEPs and all that wasn't enough for them. And sometimes in my job now, I speak to those people who had been in the BNP at the time, and they genuinely believed that the BNP were going to come to power. Genuinely believed. And basically because they lived what I always call the bubble. They just lived in this bubble. They didn't listen to the radio anymore. The BNP had TV shows and podcasts and all this, but they genuinely was like a cult. And these are people now walking around still 10 years after, more than 10 years after. And when we talk to them, they genuinely believe that the BNP were going to come to power.
It's delusion, isn't it? It's like you says.
But it's delusion. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
But it is delusion. But there's still, still in society there exist those people who aren't necessarily bad people, and they aren't necessarily Nazis, but who cannot get on with the change of pace. People who still, I guess you call them quite socially conservative. Still those people exist, and still those people, even now, with this sort of government, they're reading headlines and they believe that there's millions of people in dinghies arriving in Kent on the Cape Coast every day, and we're not reaching out to those people. We need to get that work done. Get that work done.
But Matt, it's very, it's easy for me to say, but it's very, very brave what you've done, in terms of switching and then telling the story about what's happening. But you must have feared for your life at times.
A few times. And that's not in the past. That's not in the past. Yeah, well, a few times.
That's what you're doing just now. That in itself, you're, this yourself. I'm telling you things that you already know, but you're putting yourself at danger daily because it's dangerous people ultimately that you are exposing or that you're trying to bring down, and that's now been a common theme for a number of decades.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Imagine having all them lunatics, them violent bedsit masturbators just obsessing about killing me. You know what I mean? Fantastic, isn't it? I was very surprised because of that. I wasn't on the Queen's Honours list this year, but hey ho. No, look. Yes, there are old friends and new enemies who would very much like to do me a harm. But what can I do?
Yeah.
You must be doing something right.
Do you just think
if I could sue every moron on Twitter things they say about me, I'd never be out of court. But look, it's not just me. I think there's some of the people that we work with who are still inside the far right. Sometimes they themselves don't quite grasp until it's time what a danger it could be or how dangerous it can be. I'm well aware of that. I'm well aware of that now. And I made those choices. I went to Australia for 10 years. I came back. That was the job I sort of fell into eventually. Nazis love talking to me. They love telling me the ins and outs. I mean, really, I was talking with a colleague the other day, and he just said, imagine if you could write a real book about everything you know about people. And I was like, yeah, well, maybe that will come one day. But it's a dangerous job, I guess. But, someone's got to do it. Hey, look, there's loads of people going around saying what great work they do, and more power to all of them.
Yeah.
More power to all of them.
Did your family ever tell you to take a step back? Or do you just get it? That's Matt now. He's doing good for the greater society.
It's not open for discussion. I don't discuss my work with anyone.
Yeah. I
don't. Old girlfriends, new girlfriends, ex-wives. I don't discuss it with anyone. Seriously, we had an issue, I guess, during the terror trial, and the plot to murder Rosie Cooper. There was an issue about police coming to the house. I mean, the police were more of a pain than the Nazis, for a while.
I'm not
that became very, very stressful, and changes were made, etc., etc. But generally, I just don't discuss my work. I don't discuss what I do, and that's as simple as that. Genuinely, my dad thinks I'm. I think my dad thinks I'm a Labour MP or something. He saw me on TV, and I don't know. He seems. I don't know. I don't discuss it with him, and so that's it. And the less they know, the better.
I think the work that Hope Not Hate do is fantastic though, and I seen the recent campaign that they launched around exposing Tommy Robinson's bankruptcy case as well, and
it was like the world's worst kept secret, wasn't it? That Tommy might be hiding his millions. So they've launched this campaign this week, and they have the power now to, by law, search for everything, track down every missing pound, every brick in every new house, all this kind of stuff. So that's ongoing, and it sometimes Hope Not Hate upsets people. It gets on the wrong side of people, which is unfortunately something that it has to do, really. But I think even our biggest critics realise that there's no one other than Hope Not Hate that could do something like this, and that's borne out, of course, isn't it, in the responses. When Hope Not Hate do it, things shift and things move.
I do think it's remarkable work that the organisation do as well, and just looking over your shoulder, Matt, at that Paul Heaton and Jackie Abbott poster that you've got there. Do you think that?
Oh, yeah.
You think that music's played a big part in it? I know that you've become very close to Billy Bragg over the years, and throughout your book as well, you spoke about
Uncle Bill.
You spoke about the Beautiful South and people listening to Beautiful South, and I was actually having a laugh with one of my friends the other day, and I was saying, I feel that people on the right, they often listen to left-wing musicians with this unawareness that what they're singing about.
One of the great comments ever directed at Paul Heaton, for instance, is from people that say, I wish you'd just leave the music. I wish you'd just stick to the music and leave the politics out.
Yeah.
And you think, but this is really, really true.
Sometimes
people must be just listening to different lyrics. I can't think of a Paul Heaton song that isn't political.
Exactly.
But I had this about 2 years ago and I was told this. People are watching you on TV, but they ain't necessarily paying attention. And I'd just been on Channel 4. The terror case had finished, and Nazis were behind bars. And I did a Channel 4 thing that night. And then in the morning, went into a shop. I swear to God, the woman behind the counter looked at me, and I thought, oh, maybe she saw TV last night. And she just went, oh, I saw you on TV last night. I said, did you? She went, yeah, I don't like Packies either. And I was like, what? You watched the whole show about what we did and who we are? And it's like, yeah. So, yeah.
That's outrageous.
People just don't pay attention. I don't know. But for me, music was big. I carried music even when I was like a really nasty little Nazi. I still liked Bragg, the House Martins, the Railway Children, New Order, Joy Division, sort of like quite miserable northern sort of stuff. Screwdriver, the Smiths. That turned out well, didn't it? So yeah, music's always been big for me. The only criticism of me is probably I haven't listened to a new artist in 30 years. And then you look at people like Bragg and Heaton, who are both in their 60s, or no, very nearly in their 60s and in their 60s, and you think, God almighty, how much longer are they going to keep making music I can listen to? So really, I'm stuck.
I went to see Paul and Jackie just at the end of last year, in Glasgow, and they were fantastic. But I think that they're the type of band and musicians that unite all ages. You could see there was people there with their parents and their grandparents and having the time of their life.
Kissing couples. it's kissing couples, communists, and football hooligans all together.
That's exactly it.
All together taking the different message out of Perfect 10. Yeah, but
Yeah.
Music plays a big part. I guess that's why sometimes I think people overestimate the power of music to change large things. But also I think if you look at, whenever there's been a large movement, it's needed a soundtrack. It's needed people to stand up. It's needed radical musicians. I mean, Billy Bragg's now a living treasure, for instance. But there was a time when he was a radical voice. He was saying radical things, and the same with I guess the same with Heat, and then I guess the same with all those other bands. And now there's a younger generation we hope who are coming through, and they'll have sort of tastes in music that would make my ears bleed. But we do need music. We do need art. We do need creativity, because we're up against. I guess the only good thing about this government is that hopefully it will really spur like working class kids to pick up their guitars and stuff like that and create some noise about it, because that's actually what, I know it is happening, but we're not hearing it. But it'd be really, really good if we did get some really good sort of angry jangly guitar.
Absolutely,
music.
Matt. I feel that
where are these bands? What are music venues back?
You're just not listening to them. You're just told to be listening to them, I'm telling you. The likes of, I actually think the likes of Sam Fender, from Newcastle, he's coming out and his lyrics are very...
Yeah, I like it. I like it.
Very working class.
But I don't know if they're playing it on radio too. I can't listen to that radio one.
That's the problem. And I think musicians do get political nowadays. They almost get pushed away from the Radio 1 slots as well, to a certain degree,
Yeah. So anyway, look, email me. We did this album years ago. Good Night. It was loads of really, really good musicians.
Is that when Billy Bragg's confronting the BNP at the by-election, or was it the council?
He's confronting Richard Barnbrook. That was during the general election 2010. He ran into Richard Barnbrook, and they had this. Because people always think, oh yeah, Billy Bragg turns up, plays with his guitar, but on that day, Billy Bragg carried curries up for about 300 people up the stairs on his own. Then he went out and delivered hundreds of leaflets, and he bumped into Richard Barnbrook, and they had this terrific stand-up row. Yeah, those were the good old days. Yeah, they had this terrific stand-up row. So it's a terrific photograph that's taken, and we made an album called Good Night, and we got loads of artists to contribute to it. But if there are musicians out there, we want to hear you anyway. good anti-fascist musician. No, we need creativity. We need artists.
Without going into, obviously you don't talk too much about your work, Matt. Looking forward, what do you see as the biggest threats to society at the moment coming from the far right, and what do you see as the positives to take for the future as well?
Well, the positives are that I think this government is adding to this really destructive, hateful narrative that people have about foreigners and about different countries and things like that. But this increase in, just yesterday I was pointing it out on Twitter how, a grown man who leads one of these far-right groups, he's a grown man, he's only a few years younger than me. He's obsessed by computer gaming. And he's complaining that some of the characters in his computer games, the female characters, are unrealistic. He's complaining that they've given women in computer games too much power. And I think we need to get all young boys and girls out playing football, all of them, and off these bloody computer games. There is a risk, I think, increasingly, particularly with COVID during lockdown, people became more isolated. I think people were less inclined or less able, unless they were the Prime Minister, to talk to family and friends and socialise. And I think for a lot of young people, retreated further and further into the internet. And I genuinely do think as well, there's fewer and fewer progressive voices online, or there's fewer and fewer sensible people online. And I guess there's I was talking about we need more creativity, we need more artists. I think we also need to flood those spaces where people are going looking for recreation. We need to flood those spaces. One of the ways we turned so many young people against the BNP back in 2008, 9 and 10 is that we ran the Hope Cup, the Hope Not Hate Cup in Barking and Dagenham on show day. We got hundreds and hundreds of kids from across the borough playing five-a-side and six-a-side football against each other. We offered them professional coaching. Some of them actually got a FA grade 1 coaching certificate. We had to be really, really energized at the time, I think, as a movement, right across the movement. One did and does different things. But in that period, when we saw the far right as problematic electorally, and particularly in Barking and Dagenham, we thought they might get an MP or they might take control of the council. When you saw the energy that generated in the trade union movement and in the labour movement, that people came together and said, right, what can we do to sort of cut the legs off this? And we got the going, and we got discussions going, and the great and the good in communities stood up. I'm not seeing that, although I'm sure it is happening. But we need to see more communities standing up and saying, well, how do we tackle this? How do we continue to tackle this? When you see MPs lauding the work of food banks, it's criminal.
Themselves.
It's criminal. Tory MPs going along for selfies at food banks. And donating a bag. In some regard, yes, there's an element or there's a spirit of solidarity about food banks, but we don't want them.
No.
We want food on the table. How can we tackle this? So, I'd like get people into their trade unions, get them active. We do face a bigger problem. It's a difficult problem to articulate but there is a greater far right terror threat. There are more and more of these young men stuck online with these horrific views. I mean, imagine a man in his 40s telling you that it's problematic that a woman on his computer game has got superhuman powers. You know what I mean?
Just, isn't it? It's unbelievable.
So we need to flood those spaces. We need to get our live music venues open. We need to get everyone doing karaoke if we can. But seriously, that's progressive movement. We have all the artists, we have all the musicians. Let's go out and create. Let's create this environment. Let's get people back involved. The big thing is community. Is how to find those people in our communities, but not me, because obviously I'm pretty antisocial. I just like to know and see it's going on without taking part myself. But that's what it is. We have to do this work.
No, you're spot on. You're absolutely spot on, and I think that's what the left need to be more involved with. Is actually being seen in their local communities and singing karaoke.
If I'd have known you were from Motherwell, I would have worn my Motherwell snood as a train driver in Motherwell. Yeah, I'd go and find it, but I do know where it is. Hold on, press pause.
Go for it.
Seriously, I get my Motherwell snood. The fucking man from FedEx turned up.
Good timing. Is it the Saturday service one? That's hilarious. I've seen them going about. I can guess the train driver, Matt. I'd imagine it was Jim Baxter or Tam Ferguson.
I don't know.
No.
But anyway, if the Motherwell hooligans are watching this, I'm not wearing this because it's thin.
That's funny.
I wear one of these instead.
Ah, yes. Brilliant.
Right. Oh, anyway, so that's what. So anyway, yeah.
Fantastic.
The threats are more insidious. I think they're less easy to spot. We're seeing more and more. I mean, it's weekly now. Young men on terrorist charges, and the thing that's particularly disturbing is this hatred, visceral hatred of intelligent and strong women, and running throughout it all. This hatred, we're seeing the increase in really hardcore pornography, real hardcore bestiality, and the child sexual exploitation. We're seeing a whole raft of that now in the far right amongst very, very young men who are disconnected from society. And like I say, it sounds a bit hippie-ish, but we've got to get people back out and engaged in their communities, doing community stuff. I'm not suggesting chess clubs. I'm suggesting football, rugby, or things that are accessible.
Yeah,
to people. And Motherwell Football Club do a great deal of good.
absolutely.
I wrote about them. They had this thing about school dinners.
Yep.
They had this thing about unemployed people coming to football matches. Yeah, we've really got to get. We've got to take back control of so many parts of our community. Our community assets need to fall back into
Yeah.
our hands. We need to get people back in onto the committees to take control of things. We need to talk about this rise of this violent hatred of women and young girls in society. We need to talk about all that kind of stuff, because at the moment the threat from the far right isn't electoral, but I think very, very much it's cultural and social, very, very much. And some people aren't realizing it or seeing it, but we might be hearing it, but it seems to be acceptable if Priti Patel is talking about turning people back in boats. Come on.
It's so
We need
insane.
to get our arguments and our ideas of humanity and decency back out into the community, into
Absolutely.
society.
Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Not
for your
a problem
time as
at all.
well.
And if anyone at Motherwell wants to send me a football shirt, I'm a double XL, but that's only because I'm muscular and not.
Listen, thanks to everyone who has watched or listened to this episode of the podcast. Please go back and
Oh
check.
my God, this didn't go out live, did it?
No, not at all. Not at all.
All right, yeah, because you're going to edit out all the swearing and that.
Oh, listen, you can swear all you want. Totally fine.
My
Totally fine.
employees watch this. I'm not talking about that.
That's funny.